Alright, guys, so these are just some concepts that I wanted to read ever since I finished Reproductive Racism by Suzanne Schultz. So I'll just be jumping into Michael Foucault. This is a part of the book a little bit. He's not the focus of reproductive racism, but his analysis and other people who think like him are involved in this. Anyways, Michael Foucault's Biopolitics and Biopower. Key concept. Despite their prominence in subsequent academic writing, the concepts of biopower and biopolitics are perhaps the most elusive and arguably the most compelling, given the attention they have subsequently received. The concepts of Michael Foucault's oeuvre within this published work. These concepts featured only in the last chapter of the slim first volume of History of Sexuality, The Will to Knowledge, History of Sexuality, Volume uh, 1, 1976, or sorry, 19, yeah. And while biopolitics and biopower can be seen to figure within broader conceptualizations and genealogies about power and governmentality of his lecture series at the Collège de France, largely 1975 to 76, society must be defended, security, territory, population in 1978, 1979, the birth of biopolitics. These references remain speculative and incomplete in part due to the genre of lecture series, which stands as unedited posthumous publications. Indeed, whether Foucault provides us with a coherent theory or concept of biopolitics is debatable. This notwithstanding, biopolitics and biopower continue to hold significant purchase in and for discussions on modern forms of governance and modes of subjectification. However, rather than taking these concepts as standalone and independent theoretical contribution, it is, as I demonstrate here, more productive to understand biopolitics and biopower as they function together with some of other ideas related to power and governmentality, which Foucault develops over the same period, that is, 1970s. Biopolitics and biopower. Let us begin with a brief demonstration of biopolitics and biopower, before situating these concepts with broader context of Foucault's oeuvre. In short, biopolitics can be understood as a political rationality which takes the administration of life and populations as its subject. Quote, to ensure, sustain, and multiplied life, to put this life in order. Biopower thus names the way in which biopolitics is put to work in society, and involves what Foucault describes as, quote, a very profound transformation of the mechanisms of power of the Western classic age. In The Will to Knowledge, Foucault writes of, quote, a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. Foucault, speaking here of power, he later designates as biopower, a power which significantly has a, quote, positive influence on life, my italics. This new biopower constitutes a profound transition of the mechanisms of power insofar as it differs from what Foucault associates with juridico discursive conceptualizations of power as repressive and negative, a power whose effects take the form of limit and lack. Indeed, Foucault conducts a lengthy critique of this regressive functioning of power in both the will to knowledge and society must be defended, demonstrating that such power functions to hide other productive or positive capacities of power that are also at play, particularly, for example, within the capitalist governmentality of the 19th century. The new biopower operates instead through dispersed networks, what insecurity, territory, population Foucault names the dispositive. This dispositive of power works from beneath, from the level of life itself, and as Foucault earlier described it in Society Must Be Defended, it was a type of power that presupposed a closely meshed grid of material coercions rather than a physical existence of a sovereign. Importantly, biopower did not replace repressive and deductive functions of power, but worked together with such technologies of power. Foucault writes, quote, "Deduction has tended to be no longer the major form of power, but merely one element among others, working to incite, reinforce, control, monitor, optimize, and organize the forces under it, a power bent on generating forces, making them grow, and ordering them, rather than one dedicated to impeding them, making them submit, or destroying them." However, significantly too, the structured functioning of biopower as it operates through the dispositive, where lines of power triangulate outwards, enables new kinds of resistance which can take place at the multiple points of contact which these lines of power traverse. Genealogy of power. In the last chapter of The Will to Knowledge, entitled, quote, "Right of Death and the Power Over Life," Foucault provides a brief genealogy of biopolitics. His opening sentence recalls the Schmittian view on the decisionism which determines sovereignty, speaking of how, quote, "For a long time, one of the characteristic privileges of sovereign power was the right to decide life and death. This foreign power of a juridical form. It was a power over life which could only be attested, quote, through a death he was capable of requiring. Thus, as Foucault notes, sovereign juridical power was in fact only a power to, quote, take life or let live, whereas biopower constituted, quote, a power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death. Basically, I think this is talking about, like, the fakeness of contract theory and how the state basically just molds and dictates the life overall. This is definitely above the way I think, but this is very important in terms of getting the foundations of where I really should be thinking about talking about someday, because most of the things that I read about, this is the background of that, and it's a shame that I've never read up on this type of philosophical framework. Okay, in the 17th century, the sovereign juridical form of power began to transform. Foucault traces the evolution of two forms of power which were not antithetical to each other, constituting two poles of development linked together by the whole intermediary cluster of relations. The first pole was disciplinary power, an analysis of which Foucault had developed in his previous publication Discipline and Punish, 1975, and which took the body as its focus of subjectification. The second pole Foucault describes as follows. The second form, somewhat later, focused on the species body, the body imbued with the mechanics of life, and serving as the basis of the biological processes, propagation, births, and mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity, with all the conditions that can cause these to vary. Their subversions was effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the populations. During this period, there was as Foucault recounts, quote, an explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations, marking the beginning of an era of biopower. Foucault's genealogy continues as he observes that these two poles of power were still clearly separate in the 18th century before starting to join together in the form of concrete arrangements that would go to make up the great technology of power of the 19th century. One of those arrangements he named as the discourse on sexuality. Uh, this would make sense as Thomas Malthus basically said that the bond between the sexes, mostly heterosex, to enforce the status quo at its most basic point. Okay, at this point, Foucault states that this biopower was without question an indispensable element in the development of capitalism, which made possible the controlled assertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes. This is a theme Foucault picks up from the Society Must Be Defended lecture course of 2 years earlier, wherein he describes how, quote, more general powers or economic benefits can slip into the play of these technologies of power, which are at once relatively autonomous and infinitesimal. He goes on to analyze how the Borgies grasp the disciplinary mechanisms of power developed, for example, by the prison system, as a technology for the production of docile bodies for capitalist labor, explicitly linking the biopolitical rationality with the development of capitalism. State racism. Biopolitics marks a significant historical transformation from the politics of sovereignty to the politics of society. Hence, genealogically, Foucault takes us from a sovereign who must be defended to, as a name of his earlier lecture series affirms, a society, a species, a population who must be defended. In A Will to Knowledge, Foucault describes how wars are no longer waged in the name of a sovereign who must be defended. They are waged on behalf of the existence of everyone. Entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesome slaughter in the name of life necessity. Massacres have become vital. In Society Must Be Defended, Foucault articulates this further. A battle that has to be waged not between races, but by a race that is portrayed as one true race, the race that holds power and is entitled to define the norm, and against those who deviate from that norm, against those who pose a threat to the biological heritage. Yes, once you get past the specifics and the particulars, it just becomes this amalgamation of how the machine works. And none of the substance of maybe the team players of the biological heritage of the machine. That could be the organs, I suppose. But never mind that. It is in this shift from the defense of the sovereign to the defense of society's overriding political rationality of the state that Foucault's notion of the state racism is born. He describes it as, quote, a racism that society will direct against itself, against its own elements and its own products. The internal racism of permanent purification, and it will become one of the basic dimensions of social normalization. State racism is thus, for Foucault, the essential characteristic of the modern biopolitical state. It is both the function of the modern state and that which constitutes it. Beyond biopolitics. Foucault's work in biopolitics and biopower has not been without criticisms, not only insofar as his work in this area appears fleeting and incomplete. Achille Mbembe, for example, notes Foucault's lack of the theoretical contribution of how biopower is put to work in systems of violence and domination, thus developing his notion of necropolitics, which names sovereign decisionism on death, quote, the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Another seeming limitation with biopower and biopolitics has been its apparent disregard for subjectivity. In Foucault's focus on a politics of a population and species, the biopolitical subject is not explicitly conceived within his oeuvre. This seems limiting for understanding the place of biopolitics and biopower within Foucault's oeuvre, particularly given his assertion in 1982 that the Goal of my work during the last 20 years has been to create a history of different models, or sorry, different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. However, it is in this context that biopower and biopolitics must be seen as working together with other technologies of power, repressive and disciplinary power, which operate more directly on the body and on subjectivity. Moreover, Mbembe's creates critical space for the consideration of the biopolitical or necropolitical subject in his analysis noted above. So ironically, that brings us to our next point, which happens to be Necropolitics by Achille Bembe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but this is very ironic that it talked about that as well. Okay. The economic and political management of human populations through their exposure to death has become a global phenomenon. Wars, genocide, refugee crisis, ecocide, and contemporary processes of pauperization and precarization reveal how increasing masses of individuals are now governed through their direct and indirect exposure to death. In order to unpack those processes, Achille Mbembe came up with the notion of necropolitics, first in 2003 with an essay bearing the same name, and then in 2016 with the book Politique d'Illuminati, translated and published in English in 2019 as Necropolitics. With this latter notion, Bembe explores and radicalizes Foucault's concept of biopolitics. In the last lecture of Society Must Be Defended, and in the last chapter of History of Sexuality, Foucault noticed how biopolitics, that is, the positive power over life, can become a deadly form of power. It is not only calculated management of life, but also a power to expose a whole population to death. Drawing on the dramatic experiences of the Nazi and Stalinist regimes and on the global nuclear threat, Foucault highlighted how human masses are eliminated in the name of the protection and survival of the nation, a people and/or class. Besides, he noted how racism has become the political tool that enables the biological division of the human species and the justification of the extermination of those considered inferior. Foucault insisted modern racism has developed with the colonizing genocide, so that the right to take life could be justified. Giorgio Agamben and Roberto Esposito have explored these Foucauldian observations with the notion of homo sacer and thanopolitics. Uh, Thanatopolitics. Okay, sorry guys, just trying to. I really wanted to pronounce that correctly. Okay, insisting, respectively, on the sovereign right to kill with impunity and the biological, pathological justifications of humans' exterminations, Bembe's necropolitics offers a novel approach as it draws both on Foucault and decolonial approach, often inspired in Frantz Fanon, and conceives of necropolitics as the political making of spaces and subjectivities in between of life and death. The colony in general, and the slavery plantation in particular, have given birth to those necropolitical practices fostered by white supremacy that still continue today. The subjugation of life to the power of death. Necropolitics entails a subjugation of the power of death. In our contemporary world, following Bembe, various types of weapons are deployed in the interest of maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjugated to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. This production of death worlds is carried on by three main factors I will define subsequently. On one hand, necropolitics entails a necro-economy. Oh, this might actually be my ghost economy idea, right? Well, I'm glad somebody else thought of it too. I'm really not trying to plagiarize, guys. That's pretty hilarious. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. I've actually like thought of things, and then you tend to realize that like people think of similar thoughts at times, and that's just fascinating. Okay, modern capitalism would produce nowadays an excess of populations that could not be exploited anymore, but require to be managed precisely through their exposure to deadly dangers and risks. Um, Hold on, right? The so-called climate crisis is maybe the most illustrative example of this necroeconomy, along with the current destruction of public social goods and rights. So, I think climate change is real, but in terms of how people use it for political gain, I can see where he's going with this. Um, okay. On the other hand, necropolitics draws on the confinement of certain populations in particular spaces, campsites, relying on Agamben's insights. Bembe holds that the camp form, refugee prisons, Ben Louis suburbs, favelas, has become a prevailing way of governing an unwanted population. Uh, the latter are enclosed in precarious and militarized spaces so that they can be controlled, harassed, and potentially killed. It is, quote, a paramount condition of living in pain. The third and key characteristic of necropolitics is, quote, to produce death in a larger scale. This aspect is developed, in particular, in a subpart entitled Relation Without Desire, from the first chapter, Exit from Democracy, of Necropolitics 2019. It is possible to explain this characteristic highlighting 7 traits that, according to my understanding, seem to underpin Mbembe's accounts on this issue. 1. State terror. The state persecutes, imprisons, and eliminates certain populations so that political and social concentrations can be neutralized. Those repressive tactics are operated not only to be totalitarian regimes, but also by contemporary liberal and illiberal countries. 2. The shared use of violence. In many cases, the state does not have and willingly shares a monopoly of violence with other private actors, i.e., militias, paramilitary, increasing the circulation and use of weapons in society. The latter is therefore divided between those who are protected because armed from those who are not. 3. The link of enmity. According to Bembe, in a society where the possession and non-possession of weapons define one's social value, all social bonds are destroyed. The link of enmity normalizes, therefore, the idea that power can be acquired and exercised only at the price of another's life. 4. War. Coercion itself has become a market commodity. Nowadays, war and terror have become modes of production on their own, and as such need to generate new military markets. Yes, like what Echo Embarto said, America needing to create a new enemy after World War II. 5. The predation of natural resources. In order to exploit valuable natural resources, populations are displaced and eliminated, i.e. indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest, though the active and hidden collaboration of the state, public forces, international corporations, and criminal organizations. 6. Different modes of killing. The exposure to death is multiple. Tortures, mutilations, mass killings, high-tech elimination through drone strikes represent various modalities of necropolitical devices. 7. Different moral justifications. According to Bembe, atrocities are justified for various reasons such as eradication of corruption, different types of therapeutic liturgy, the desire for sacrifice, messianic uh, Ishtologies, and even modern discourses of utilitarianism, materialism, and consumerism. Necropolitics implies, therefore, a closed entrenchment of political, economic, and military devices oriented towards the elimination of human populations. But along with this aspect, necropolitics is also deployed through small doses of death that structure the everyday life of individuals. Yes, just like population control shouldn't be confused with genocide, because the scale at which that most people perceive, I believe that is the illusion of the difference, is the time it takes and the scale of when people notice bodies dropping or not. And so that's all it takes, is to kill like millions of people just slowly and not in a very noticeable way to the economy necessarily. Okay. Less human than human. Along with mass killings and exterminations, Bembe argues that necropolitics implies surveillance on individuals not so much for the purpose of discipline, but to extract them from a maximum of utility, such as in the case of sexual slavery. The installation of those small doses of death in the daily existence of many individuals also comes from unbounded social, economic, and symbolic violence that destroy their bodies and their value of their social existence. Daily humiliations perpetuated by public forces on certain populations, the strategy of small massacres inflicted one day at a time in the absence of basic social goods, e.g. sanitation, housing, bring about a kind of existence whose value is, quote, is a sort of death able to be inflicted upon it. Under those circumstances, necropolitics consists, quote, in the power to manufacture an entire crowd of people who specifically live at the edge of life, or even on its outer edge, people for whom living means continually standing up to death. This life is a superfluous one, therefore, whose price is so meager that it has no equivalence, whether market or even less human. Nobody even bears the slightest feeling of responsibility or justice towards this sort of life, or rather death. Necropolitical power proceeds by a sort of inversion between life and death, as if life was merely death's medium. Under everyday necropolitics, a mass of populations live under extreme precarious conditions, and as such can be exploited and eliminated naturally. Bembe singles out racism as the main criteria that allow necropolitics to be performed and expand in society, along with an hydraulic racism that defines institutional racism, state law, administration. Bembe pays attention to the so-called nano-racism that is deployed in everyday social relations and is designed to stigmatize, to injure, and to humiliate those not considered to be one of us, taking into account current political, social, symbolic forms of violence that are deployed worldwide. Bembe's notion of necropolitics represents a relevant heuristic category for contemporary critical thought. True. So, when he said hydraulic racism, I thought of like the Freudian sexual hydraulic theory. So, this is definitely spot on. Like, I've actually thought of that too. This is profound. I'm actually blown away with this in some ways. That's all I really had to say on the matter, honestly. There really is this like Freudian hydraulic pressure of like racism that's that like there always has to be that white person that really just has to like say the N-word, even if there's a soft A. Like, they just gotta say it, guys. So true. Like, I get that feeling sometimes from people around me. Like, people at work, like, kids these days, seriously. Okay. I will see ya.